Amen. Thank you, Deb. Go ahead and get in your Bible to Nehemiah chapter 6. Nehemiah chapter 6. We have on Sunday nights been going through Nehemiah, and I have never liked when preachers basically just pick whatever happened that week, or even worse, just have some message in the back of their Bible and they see somebody there and then they break that message out. I don't do that. I just prayerfully prepare series weeks and months in advance and trust the Lord to bring the people to those services that need to hear them. Nehemiah is an interesting book. He's an interesting man. By anybody's reckoning, Nehemiah's life and work was significant. He was certainly a man with a lot of character. He was a man with a lot of faith. He's a man that we would describe in today's term as being a layman. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet. He was a faithful man that God blessed and used. He was not just the kind of guy like so many people who point out problems, but offer no solutions and certainly don't volunteer themselves to be any part of the solution. Nehemiah was the kind of guy that when he saw a problem, he got his hands dirty. He wanted to be a part of the solution. He wanted to fix things. By anybody's reckoning, Nehemiah was a great leader. And all of us here in different times and different capacities of our life, we are leaders, and so he's someone we can learn from in that regard. Remember, the book of Nehemiah began in the palace of the greatest nation on the face of the earth at that time, the nation of Persia. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer, had access to great wealth, access to all the most important and prominent people of that day, but he heard and was burdened that the walls of the city of Jerusalem that had lain in rubble for about 140 years left the people of God, the Jews, in reproach among the people around them. And so he left the wealth and prominence of the palace, traveled 1,000 miles to rebuild the walls and reset the gates of a city that had been just destroyed for 140 years. And by the way, if Nehemiah would have stayed in the comfort of the palace, if he would have stayed where he had more money, if he would have stayed where he had more ease, we wouldn't know his name today. But because he did the will of God in his life, we all know his story and we read about it, have been studying it now for several weeks on Sunday nights. And I just simply say to you tonight, whatever the will of God is for your life, if you do it, you will be better off in life and you will be better off in eternity. The one God is looking for is very rarely, though occasionally it is, a missionary to go to a foreign field. The will of God for someone's life is very rarely, though it is on occasion, for you to stand and pastor and preach and lead a church. Most of the time, the vast majority of God's people, our job to be the one is to, in our circle of life, be that light for Jesus Christ. Nehemiah did that. Last week, we asked ourselves the question, how do you want to be remembered? And we continued to see Nehemiah take less than he could have taken and spend more than was required to spend for a cause that was greater and bigger than he was. Last week, remember, we talked about how from his own personal finances, for years, he, instead of taxing the Jews, fed 150 people, the whole government staff, if you will, at his own expense, because he was burdened to not tax the Jewish people further there in their poverty. And we saw how Nehemiah wanted people to remember him, but most importantly, Nehemiah wanted God to remember him for good, God to remember what he had done for the people of God. And we again emphasize this very simple thing. What we do to God's people, we do to God. How we treat Christian people, especially those in the church where we attend, that's how we're treating Christ. Kindness, goodness, are a wonderful thing to do to the people of God. Now, the focus of Satan's attack in our story is now going to move. So far, for 5 chapters, or 4 of the 5 chapters, because for chapter 1 was a little bit different, Satan has been attacking the workers. Now, he's going to begin to attack Nehemiah. Someone defined leadership as influence, and that's certainly true. Influence is a part of leadership. Someone else defined leadership as the authority to make decisions, and certainly exercising authority is an aspect of leadership. Someone else defined leadership as a position in a company or an organization, and that too is an aspect of leadership. And though we're not going to talk about it directly tonight, one of the things I believe to be greatly misunderstood is leadership and authority. For the most part, people don't like anyone's leadership, especially the authority kind, unless it's their own leadership. But listen to me, sensible people know that when there's no one providing leadership, things don't get done that could otherwise be done. When there's no one providing leadership, people do not achieve what they would otherwise achieve. When there's no one providing leadership, people are not safer and better off. And if you don't believe that, just glance at the anarchy in Portland and Seattle, where the leaders have failed to provide leadership. Now, I'm sure, human nature being what it is, a lot of the Jewish people, they didn't appreciate Nehemiah's leadership. Or more accurately, they appreciated his leadership when he did what they wanted him to do, and they did not appreciate it when he didn't. But Nehemiah still provided leadership. See, leaders are not always supposed to do what people want. Leaders are always supposed to do what people really need. That's what leadership is. Now, the internal conflict among the workers caused by financial hardship had been settled by Nehemiah. The work continued. The laughter of their enemies and the mischaracterization of what they were there to do, Nehemiah worked through that, and the work continued. They were threatened by their enemies with physical violence, and Nehemiah had made preparation to have them prepared to be attacked, and the work still continued. The people complained about being tired and how big of a mess the work site was, but Nehemiah led through that, and the work continued. But in our story, Satan is about to change tactics again. He has a new target. And that target, as I said earlier, is now Nehemiah himself. Listen, Nehemiah was a great leader with a lot of faith and character. He wasn't just a good man, he was a great man. But listen to me, he was still just a man. You've heard me say this many times, the best from among men is still a man at best. And so, by the way, that's true for every pastor, that's true for every husband, that's true for every parent, that's true for every boss in your workplace. He'd been a faithful and a wise shepherd to the people of God in a difficult time. And so now Satan is going to go after Nehemiah for the same reason he goes after every leader within the sound of my voice. To quote Jesus, smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. If you would tonight stand and honor the word of God, not the weed of God. For those of you who think the weed of God is marijuana, you are deceived. So it helps me think clearly. No, Satan is playing with your head. Title of my thought before I chase that rabbit is don't come down from your work. Don't come down from your work. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 1. Now it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had builded the wall and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief. And I sent messengers unto them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you? Thank you. Might be seated. We see in verse 1 that word had reached Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem. Remember, through this entire story, they are the perpetual enemies of Israel and of Nehemiah and of this work of God. They received word that there was no breach left in the wall. What an incredible accomplishment. It's estimated that the wall was 2.5 miles long, 40 feet tall, and 8 foot thick. A wall that had been lying in rubble for about 140 years and neglected for the last 90 years after the Jews had returned to their land. There were 10 large gates on those walls, large gates. None of those were complete. And it is very likely that though there was no breach, no hole left in the wall, they had not finished it up yet to the full height. But what an incredible accomplishment. Well, as we see, just like before, there were still gossips and talebearers reporting everything that happened in Jerusalem to Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, informing people that they knew to be the enemies of God, that they knew to be the enemies of Nehemiah, that they knew to be the enemies of this work, and yet they still gossiped and brought these reports to them, even though they knew they were hindering God's work. By the way, it shouldn't surprise anyone that Satan can always find some disloyal people who make little or no effort to control their tongue, who keep things stirred up in and around the work of God. Satan found them then, and you can mark it down, he will always find them today as well. Now keep your hand there. If you go back to chapter 4 and verse 7, it says it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, that they were very wroth. Now they were very angry just at hearing that these holes were beginning to be filled. And you might imagine now that they actually were filled and that the wall was complete other than its height and the gates. You can imagine how angry they were at this time. Obviously, Satan had to try something else. And because Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem were pawns in the hands of Satan, they obviously had to try something else, because there was never any lack of pawns for Satan to find and use to hinder the people and work of God. Listen, Satan is never going to come to you as Satan. No one would fall for that. I mean, somebody's not going to come to you and say, by the way, I'm representing Satan and I would like to tell you what's bothering me. That's not the way it works. It's always going to be couched in some religious garb or some phrase, you know, I've been praying for such and so, but. Satan always must disguise himself to be effective. And if you and I are not careful, we will be his pawns in weak moments, hinder the work and people of God instead of helping them. I wonder what Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem will do now. All their previous attempts to stop the work by hurting the people have failed. Notice their new target in verse 2. They write to Nehemiah to set up a meeting with them. Sanballat and Geshem, it says in chapter 6 and verse 2, send unto me, saying, come, let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief. Now I know some people hate meetings, but some meetings are necessary for good communication and good organization. Nehemiah, though he wasn't a preacher or a prophet or a priest, he was a great organizer and planner. And that's part of the reason God used him in such a special way on this great project. But understand this, not all meetings are good, nor are all meetings helpful. It depends on who's in the meeting, and it depends what they're meeting about. And depending on those things, meetings can be very bad, both for the work of God and the people involved in the meeting. This particular meeting that they tried to set up was not going to be one that would have helped the people or the work of God or Nehemiah. Now understand this, when Nehemiah gets this letter to set up this meeting, understand that he would have been tempted to do this. Godly people have always been peace-loving people. In fact, the New Testament tells us as believers to seek peace and ensue it, to pursue peace whenever it is possible. You see, but wise and godly leaders, though we seek peace, understand that at times conflict is inevitable. There will always be some who try to get the faithful people faithfully following Jesus and taking their stand. There will always be some who try to get them to set aside part of their faith for the sake of peace. Now, Nehemiah previously had made sure that these men understood where they stood. Keep your hand there, but go back in chapter 2. In the very beginning of this project, in chapter 2 in verse 19, it says, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, 'What is this thing that you do? Will you rebel against the king?' Then answered I them and said unto them, 'The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build, but ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem.'" From the very beginning, Nehemiah made it very clear. This is the work of God. This is the work of the people of God. This is not you. You have nothing to do with this. Now, I'm sure Nehemiah wanted peace, but he was not willing to sacrifice truth for the sake of peace. Now, the town of Ono that we just read was in the land that used to be the land of Benjamin. It was allegedly about 27 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Now, while that might not seem much to you and I because we travel around by cars, when you're going 27 miles on dirt roads on a donkey or a horse or in a chariot, that's a long ride. It's not like you just slip out from work early at 2 and say, "I'm going to go have this meeting," and come back in the same day. This is a couple of days that it would have taken to do this. And these same people who had laughed at and threatened and opposed everything Nehemiah stood for now wanted to meet. Nehemiah knew they weren't up to any good. He knew they couldn't be trusted. He knew they planned to hurt him if he left the safety of the city of Jerusalem. He knew that. But I'm sure he was tempted to go. I mean, who wouldn't want to see some resolution with the ongoing conflict with these men? Who wouldn't want some measure of peace if it were possible? There's no sensible person that just wants to live in continual conflict. You can imagine how Nehemiah would have desired peace. But all of us must know our spiritual enemy. Satan never extends a hand to us, but what he has a knife in the other hand to stick us in the back if we take his hand. And it's hard for you and I to relate to, but understand this: Satan wants to destroy everything good and godly and wholesome and meaningful, not just in our world and not just in churches. He wants to do that in your home. Satan is an enemy of your marriage. He is an enemy of you parenting your children to grow up to be people with faith and character. He is an enemy to you finding and doing the will of God for your life. He's not a friend. In fact, he loves rebellion. He loves anarchy. If Satan were in America today, he would be an Antifa. And if you're sympathetic to that, you're sympathetic to the devil himself. Sometimes peace is not possible because the agenda of the people involved is just too contrary to the truth to work together. And any kind of real peace that's going to last must have truth at its foundation, or it will not last. By the way, when it comes to Sanballat and Geshem and Tobiah trying to set up this meeting, they're trying to get everybody together. And I hope you understand tonight that part of the agenda of the Antichrist that's coming is to unite the world religions. And here tonight thinking that it'd be a great thing if all the world's religions were united. That is the Antichrist type of thinking. Because religions cannot unite without setting aside key things to who they say they are. By the way, it's the same with the ecumenical movement in what's called Christianity. You and I, if we are Bible believers, we have nothing in common with those who say the Bible is not the Word of God, that Jesus is not the Son of God, or that salvation is not by the grace of God. We have nothing in common with them. You say, Brother Wally, wouldn't you like peace? I would love for all those who name the name of Christ to be at peace, but that's not our lot in this life. That is not going to happen till Jesus Christ Himself comes back and settles all this business. Nehemiah, in like manner, knew they wanted things from him he was unwilling to change. So he refused to even meet. He knew that compromising on this project or how he believed God wanted him to do it would lead ultimately to his destruction. Which gets us to our second thing, number 2. Nehemiah communicated to them that he would not stop working in the wall to meet with them. Notice in verse 3 of chapter 6, he said, "And I sent messengers unto them, saying, I'm doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you?" In fact, this stand of refusing to meet was something Nehemiah had to do 4 times. One refusal was not enough. Remember that from verse 4? "Yet they sent unto me 4 times after this sort, and I answered them after the same manner." Now, for those of you who have been around the work of Christ for any length of time, or been someone who has tried to live with character for decades, you understand and know that one stand for something that's good and right is never going to be enough. But rather that you and I, over the course of years and circumstances, will be challenged over and over and over to redraw those lines we had courage to draw. I wish I could tell you tonight that one stand at work would be enough, or one stand in your school would be enough, or one stand in your family would be enough, but that's not the way it works. Human nature is such that everyone is always trying to bring you down to their level. Everyone is trying to bring you down to their level. If you are living a life that is a light for Jesus Christ, a light that reflects His righteousness and His love and His tenderness and His compassion and everything that He stood for, understand that the people in the circle of your life, they need you to be that light, but they would much rather you be like them. And so you will have to redraw the lines of your life over and over and over again. By the way, the most dangerous time for a Christian is any time of transition. If you're in a time of transition in life, what that means is that you're going to have to redraw lines that you drew. Say, Brother Wally, what do you mean by transition? I mean, you just bought a new house. I mean, you just had a child or had another child. I mean, you just changed jobs. I mean, you just began to work in a different ministry. You just went from being single to being married. You just finished and graduated from school. Any kind of transition in your life is one of the most vulnerable times that you have in your spiritual life. And by the way, for the last 6 months, all of us have been going through a vulnerable time. It has been a time of transition in every area of our life. It has been a time of transition in the church as what goes on has changed week to week and month to month. It has been a transition with your students as what has changed from week to week and month to month. It has been a transition in our workplace. It has been a transition in our culture. And all of us, whether we recognize it or not, are at a very vulnerable time in our spiritual life, as the lines that we've drawn, somebody has come along and basically just taken that line you drew in the sand and they've smeared the sand over it. Communicated to them 4 separate times. No, I'm not going to do that. By the way, every parent here knows what it's like for you to say no to your kid about something and then they just keep asking? And what they keep hoping is that each time you're going to give them a different answer. And because they've been with you for years, what they've learned is that they can wear you down. And then you have so many things to do, and they have very little to do other than get their way with you. And so they just keep working on you and working on you and working on you to try to get some line you've drawn changed. But it's not just children who are like that. Adults are like that too. My wife will tell you, if she doesn't give me the answer I want, that I just keep asking the question. Don't laugh, you're no better. Listen, all of us grow weary of drawing lines and saying no, and I hope you're drawing them someplace that would please Christ, and saying no in places you should say no, and yes in places you should say less. All I'm simply saying this is that in a time of transition, we're very vulnerable. Nehemiah was vulnerable. It was this project. Everything was changing that had been the same way for 90 years since the Jews had been back. But he had enough good sense to say, no, I'm not going to join you. I don't have anything in common with you really. And that any peace you want is going to somehow be at an expense of something that's dear to God or the work of God or to me. And so I'm not even going to meet. Next week, if the Lord tarries, we'll get to what else Satan is going to try. But that gets me to our last thing, number 3. My attention from these scriptures is how Satan tempted Nehemiah, and I want to focus on something Nehemiah said in verse 3. He says, I'm doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you? He refused to come down from Jerusalem. By the way, in the Bible, everything's down from Jerusalem. He refused to come down from the wall. He understood the wall was a great work. But this project being a great work isn't what captured my attention for tonight. Here's what's captured my attention. Here's the main thought I want to leave with you tonight. If Nehemiah compromised by leaving for a couple of days to meet with Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the work he was sent to do would have stopped. Did you see what he said there? Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you? Now, to some, that may seem like a selfish, self-focused way to look at his role. To others, it reflects the attitude of an individual who understood the importance of them filling the role God gave them. Like so many things in the life of Nehemiah, this attitude is a reflection of his maturity and heart for God's people. He understood how many people were looking to him for example. He understood that people were depending on him for instruction and inspiration in this key difficult time. He understood that every day mattered at that particular time in that particular project. He understood that the only thing standing between the nobles who were trying to take advantage of the workers was him. Now, it's easy to look back and say, why would the workers quit if Nehemiah went away for a couple of days? No one's that important. And I'm sure that went through some of your minds. But listen to me. Any leader filling the role God called and commanded them to fill will always hurt others when they leave it. Did you hear me? Any leader filling the role that God called and commanded them to fill hurts others when they leave it. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a family when a father decides to abandon leadership of his home to leave his wife and children. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a family when a mother decides to abandon her God-given role as wife or mother. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a family when when the parents refuse to love one another and properly discipline and lead their children. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to parents when some teenager decides to abandon God and live immorally and walk away from the way they were raised. I would to God that every member in the family understood that their decisions not only affect them as an individual, but they affect everyone around them and often leave deep wounds and scars on everyone in the family. The words of the Apostle Paul from Romans 14 ring so true, and we too rarely think of them, and they are this: for none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. Did you hear that? What that means, in effect, is any decision you and I make has roots and branches that affect the people around us. Did you hear that? I say to every family member tonight, don't come down from the role you fill in your home. We may not like the role God assigned us to. We may not like the way He's gifted us. We may not like where He has us right now. I'm just saying to you, don't come down from that, because if you do, someone will be hurt. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a church when anyone on the staff or deacons chooses to sin willfully against God or change key doctrines. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a church when anyone decides to be disloyal or troublesome over non-biblical issues. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a children's class when the teacher abandons their responsibility to prepare and pray for the week. Well, I'm just so tired this week. Well, I didn't sleep well last night. Well, I was just so busy. I'll guarantee you had time for Facebook. I guarantee you. If it's not Facebook, it's Snapchat or Instagram or whatever platform it is that you like. Listen, every one of us have time for the things that really matter to us. Don't tell me it doesn't matter when nursery workers who are supposed to be there are no call, no show, or show up the last minute. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to every ministry of any sort when those who are supposed to lead or fill some responsibility decide to come down from being faithful. Don't tell me it doesn't matter to a church when members are physically able and around all the time, do little or nothing to serve in a ministry. Listen, I've said this many times, and I will keep saying it as long as God gives me breath. I believe that every member of Bible Baptist Church ought to be specifically serving in a ministry. I would to God that the members of Bible Baptist Church would come to this simple realization that when you decide to do or not do what it is God has gifted and called you to do, it does not affect you only. It affects many people. For none of us live to himself, and no man dieth to himself. And I just say to every member of Bible Baptist, don't come down from the role you fill for Christ's sake in His work here. See, Nehemiah wasn't like that. He didn't overestimate his importance, but neither did he think he could just go AWOL for a couple of days and not think it wouldn't hurt the people and work of God. Let me ask you tonight as we close, what is it you think God sent you to do? Where are you tempted to compromise, sidestep, or think only of yourself? Listen, if you are somebody who simply comes faithfully here, I guarantee you that there are people who are hurt when you say, I'm not going to do that anymore. It may not matter to you, but in the weakness of my flesh, I don't ever think anything good when someone just decides to stop showing up. I know who's here, that normally is here. The first thing that goes through my mind is, well, I wonder what I did. I wonder what I failed to do. I wonder where they're going. Say, preacher, you shouldn't think like that. You should just trust God. So should you. Listen, I'm no different than you. I've told you this many times. I'm a sinner saved by the grace of God. I'm standing here only because God gifted and called me to do what I'm doing right now. I'm just simply saying to everybody here, stop thinking just about yourself. And understand that everything you do in your family, in your life, and in the Lord's work affects a lot of people. Amen? If you'd quietly stand tonight. Bow your heads.